How'd the pedophiles get in control of AI?
The pedophiles at a whatever level,
they rule.
The devil, whatever you want to call it, this interdimensional thing that gives them advanced off-world technology, the fallen one that's not of this world, is giving them advanced knowledge on how to construct these systems that have already been used before on other populations.
Ancient Aliens is remarkable. It's the perfect junk food show, as delectable yet nutritionally defunct as a big bag of potato chips. Is it skeevy and intellectually dishonest and, probably not deserving of a place on the History Channel? Oh, yeah, totally, 100%. But is it also wildly entertaining?
So you have to ask yourself, did extraterrestrials in some way influence this battle by disguising themselves as a familiar figure like George Washington? It would seem that something like this happened.
Absolutely. Over the course of an average episode, Ancient Aliens will weave together bits of history, mythology, and sci-fi into a really fun urban fantasy setup taking place just below the surface of our real world. In doing so, it draws from a long history of pseudoscientific thought, from fringe occult Nazi shit to old colonialist views on sociology. And because of this, inadvertently or not, it can end up spreading a lot of outdated, incorrect, and frankly racist theories. So join me, won't you, for a deconstruction of my guilty pleasure show's problematic subtext, because that's what we do in video essays, right?
Thousands of years ago, these hunters found a backwater planet. They taught humans how to build, and were worshipped as gods.
Many of the fields Ancient Aliens discusses, like archaeology, anthropology, or history, were once rife with colonialist propaganda. While modern scholars work to excise these lines of thoughts from their fields, mystics, quack scientists, and racists, among others, have embraced them. Like any good fringe field, pseudo-archaeology ravenously incorporates disproven theories into its cosmology. It's from this field of geeky Indiana Jones wannabes that Ancient Aliens draws most of its quote-unquote experts.
Giorgio Tsoukalos met with local ancient astronaut theorist Evan Strong to get a first-hand look at these enigmatic carvings.
Wow! That's incredible.
Or as they call them, theorists.
Ancient astronaut theorist.
The way we talk about space aliens today is indelibly tied to the way we used to talk about human aliens. Today, being steeped in science fiction lingo and globalist culture, it's easy to forget that before we knew other planets existed, alien simply meant a foreigner, and alien invasion carried very different connotations. Long before the likes of H.G. Wells, there was a widespread invasion force of sorts, bent on taking over the world. It was called colonialism. Colonialism fucking sucks. For all the philosophical musing done about it, it's just a way for one people to subjugate and exploit another. It's conquering, ruling, and exploiting, pure and simple.
As empires spread across the globe, historically the British and the French have been the most important in terms of the East. They conquer not only militarily, but also what we could call ideologically. The question for these empires is, how do we understand the natives that we are encountering so we can conquer and subdue them easier? This process of using large abstract categories to explain people who look different, whose skin is a different color, has been going on for a long time.
The practice dates back thousands of years. Egypt, China, Rome, Greece, and the Phoenicians were all known to establish colonies. But the term colonialism, big C in quotes I suppose, tends to describe the European plundering of the world that lasted from between the 15th to 20th centuries.
We have a history of 400 years of colonial rule, and that colonialism has left traces. These traces are to be found in our language, in our culture, in institutions, in the way we look at ourselves and at others.
Related, though slightly distinct, is the practice of imperialism, where one group of people only gain partial control over another through economic, complicated things so they can exploit them that way. With these two practices, by 1914, Europe controlled 84% of the globe. Since World War II, the practice continues in the form of neocolonialism, where the same colonialist power structures are propagated, though further obfuscated through complex global economies.
Why are resource-rich African countries like Nigeria underdeveloped? And I think we can understand Africa's underdevelopment through three key arguments. One, we can understand it by looking at how African countries are incorporated and continue to be incorporated into the global political economic system. Two, we can also look at the dynamics and practices of the colonial legacy and how has such a history manifested in the post-colonial. And three, we can also look at the practices and policies that have been put in place by Bretton Woods institutions, specifically the International Monetary Fund, also known as the IMF.
Those driving colonialism back in the day naturally loved to present it as a force for good, an extending of civilization of sorts. The idea was that Europe was, of course, civilized, and it was its duty to bring this civilization to the rest of the savage, undeveloped world. Europe told itself that it's the white man's burden to rule over others, because if they didn't, the world would descend into primeval madness. Controlling the conversation around topics of race, civilization, history, and the duality between advanced and primitive people was key to maintaining colonialist power. While colonial authority was solely derived by means of force, it was justified as the manifestation of natural historical forces set in motion by God himself. It was assumed that all cultures started off as primitive, like the Garden of Eden, and started gaining material and cultural developments before they became civilized, like Europe. Institutions like the natural sciences, the state, the press, the arts, and the church all played a part in normalizing and naturalizing this framework through the propaganda we talked about before. There's a fundamental element of magical thinking behind this idea. It assumes a predestined path that all cultures go through, with a set destiny. Colonialists thought their mission to be divine and viewed themselves as a necessary civilizing force, simply acting out the natural order. That way, by colonizing others, they were helping them, not exploiting them. Lord Randolph Churchill, father of Winston, gave a speech in 1885 explaining his country's subjugation of India thusly. Our rule in India is, as it were, a sheet of oil spread out over the surface of, and keeping calm and quiet, and unruffled by storms, an immense and profound ocean of humanity. Underneath that rule lies hidden all the memories of fallen dynasties, all the traditions of vanquished races, all the pride of insulated creeds, and it is our task, our most difficult business, to give peace, individual security, and general prosperity to the 250 million people that are afflicted by these powerful forces, to bind them and to wield them by the influence of our knowledge, our law, and our higher civilization, in process of time, into one great, unified people, and to offer to all nations of the West the advantages of tranquility and progress in the East. That is our task for India. That is our title to India. And I say that a task so difficult, so gigantic, and yet so beneficent, ought to command the sympathy and friendly assent of every European power.
The British always thought of themselves as liberators, as bringers of freedom.
The British indiscriminately massacred large numbers of the Kurdish population, often whole villages at a time.
The British believed the final and necessary justification of their empire was a moral one. The British kept the peace.
Up to 1 million Indians and Pakistanis were killed in the ensuing sectarian violence after the upheaval.
They brought sound, honest administration.
We rounded up 1.5 million Kenyans, including Barack Obama's grandfather, and put them into concentration camps.
And they insisted that basic moral standards were honored.
Up to 29 million Indians starved to death under British rule, while we exported and stockpiled millions of tons of food from the country. Former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill once said, and I quote, "I hate the Indians. They are beastly people with a beastly religion. The famine was their own fault for breeding like rabbits."
Now that's bad. The image of the Indian people is so primitive they're unable to even rule themselves without descending into chaos is awful. And the implication that peace, individual security, and general prosperity are Europe's to give to other parts of the world is unspeakably presumptuous. But what does any of this have to do with ancient aliens? Well, back in the day, Europe needed a way to justify taking over the world, so they turned to media to help push their excuses. This included writings by philosophers or theologians, the adventure novels of heroic colonizers setting out on vast untamed lands, or the speech from Churchill we just cited. The ideas put forward by this long outdated propaganda is largely pushed to the fringe today. And that's the exact fringe where Ancient Aliens gets a lot of its theorists. In his 1978 seminal book, Orientalism, famous academic Edward Said, founder of the field of post-colonial studies and former British imperial subject himself, argues that every single empire in its official discourse has said that it is not like all the others, that its circumstances are special, that it has a mission to enlighten, civilize, bring order and democracy, and that it uses force only as a last resort. And sadder still, there always is a chorus of willing intellectuals to say calming words about benign and altruistic empires, as if one shouldn't trust the evidence of one's own eyes, watching the destruction and misery and death brought on by the latest mission's chivalrons.
If somebody, let's say in the 1850s or 60s, in Paris or London, wished to talk about or read about India or Egypt or Syria, there would be very little chance for that person to simply address the subject, as we like to think, in a kind of free and creative way. A great deal of writing had gone before, and this writing was an organized form of writing, like an organized science, you know, what I've called Orientalism. And it seemed to me that there was a kind of repertory of images that kept coming up, you know, the sensual woman who's there to be sort of used by the man. The East is a kind of mysterious place full of secrets and monsters.
The ancient Indians were very clear in describing how vimanas were used for the gods to come down from their heavenly abodes to earth.
The Sanskrit texts of the Hindu and Buddhist tradition talk about incredible flying craft called vimana. They're sort of a cross between a modern stealth fighter and a flying saucer.
It describes the propulsion system, it describes what they were able to do, like go really fast, become invisible. They had powerful weapons. I mean, it reads like Star Wars.
You didn't get what you could call realistic representations of the Orient, either in literature or in painting or in music or any of the arts. And this extended even further into descriptions of the Arabs by experts.
It's important to note that a lot of seemingly New Age pseudo-archaeology ends up reaffirming pre-existing systems of beliefs.
Hundreds of thousands of people around the world believe, as all aliens do, that we were created by advanced scientists from another planet who made us in their image. Those extraterrestrial creators mentioned in the Bible as the Elohim have continued throughout history to monitor our progress and have also sent us messengers, including Jesus, the Buddha, Mohammed, and a few dozen others throughout the centuries.
Pseudo-archaeological theories can be politically motivated and sometimes veer into troubling colonialist lines of thought. Subconsciously affirming the classic model of social evolution, they're not necessarily doing this consciously, but when you're pouring through the logs of 18th century explorers for evidence of Atlantis, you might just end up recycling some of the archaic rhetoric. A post on archaeologyexpert.co.uk discusses the relationship between pseudo-archaeology and nationalism in particular. A frequent motivation to engage in pseudo-archaeology is radical nationalism. Imperial ideologies of the recent past used the results of archaeology to advance their empires. Often it was considered necessary to fake the data in order to pursue a particular emphasis for the nation. Some nations thought that rewriting history via archaeology would benefit their political aims. One of the older and more popular pseudo-archaeological areas of interest is trying to explain how artistic or technological achievements outside Europe were built by some kind of lost civilization, hitherto unknown to academia. This is, of course, because the people of those regions are too, primitive to have done it themselves. Yeah. These days, it's not unheard of to see people argue that the pyramids were built by aliens, but back when Europeans colonized Africa, Asia, and the Americas, they credited archaeological findings to secret, lost, magical civilizations, who, of course, generally tended to be, white. Funny that. A great example of this was the debate over who built the giant earthen mounds found throughout America. These flat-top pyramids were built out of the soil and used for religious, ceremonial, burial, and residential purposes. They were built by various Native American groups, including the Calusa, Hopewell, and Adena cultures, between 3500 BCE and the 16th century CE. Early European Americans, however, thought that these were far too advanced to have been built by the Native Americans, and were instead built by some long-lost quote-unquote mound builder people.
Who had labored to build such astonishing works? Surely not the few surly and clearly uncivilized Indians who then lived in the area. But almost anyone else was a candidate. Harvard University's Ian Brown.
They were attributed to Vikings, the Welsh, the lost tribes of Israel. You name it, every group had some sort of responsibility for the construction of the mounds, except the Indians.
By the early 1800s, the popular imagination was seized by the idea that America had once been peopled by a race of supermen, or at least of white men.
Erroneous reports of a 9-foot human skeleton excavated from one of the mounds led to speculation that they were built by a race of white biblical giants. How they could tell they were white from just the bones is anyone's guess, but hey, the Bible said there used to be giants, so there you go, church is on board. In one case, the Mormons used the mounds as evidence for their case that the 10 lost tribes of Israel landed and settled in America. Thomas Jefferson even used the myths to justify the Indian Removal Act, asserting that the First Nations peoples were evil genocidal barbarians who wiped out the mound builder people and deserved to be punished for it. He claimed, "In the monuments and fortifications of an unknown people, we behold the memorials of a once powerful race exterminated to make room for the existing savage tribes." In this strange historical mistake should be something that would be written off to the history books, but it continues to be popular today for some reason.
Why would a so-called primitive people have constructed a massive earthwork? Could the Serpent Mound be a marker where extraterrestrial beings mined iridium as an energy source, as some ancient astronaut researchers believe? And if so, might there be a connection between energy in the ground here and that found in the Nazca Plain? Perhaps more clues can be found by examining the mysterious crop circles discovered throughout the world.
The Southern Poverty Law Center writes, "In recent decades, as evidence of a richer Paleo-American record than previously realized has come to light, Jackson's once powerful race has found a new generation of boosters on the far right, where fantasies of white genocide, distantly past and currently unfolding, are an animating obsession." What location do people often claim is built by aliens, even jokingly? The pyramids, right? Notice how people much more rarely argue that sites like the Colosseum or the Parthenon were built by aliens. We just take it at face value that the Romans built them because we already view them as advanced and civilized. In his article, Racism is Behind the Outlandish Theories of Africa's Ancient Architecture, South African postdoctoral researcher of vertebrate paleoarchaeology, Julian Benoit, goes into more detail about this bias. He states, "People have no problem believing that medieval Europe built the continent's magnificent cathedrals only using ropes, sticks, and wood. They dismiss scientific research that overwhelmingly proves ancient Africans' prowess, but insist the documents, which contain evidence of Europeans' construction process, are beyond reproach. Why is it so hard for some to acknowledge that the ancient non-European civilizations, like the Aztecs, people of Easter Island, ancient Egyptians, or Bantu speakers from southern Africa, could create intricate structures? The answer is unfortunately as simple as it seems. It boils down to profound racism and a feeling of white superiority that emanates from the rotting corpses of colonialism. Colonialist powers saw their subjects in Africa, South America, and Southeast Asia as exotic, fascinating, but ultimately primitive. An increasing knowledge and understanding of the archaeological record mostly dispelled these notions. But for some, and until nowadays, it seems unthinkable that ancient non-European societies have been resourceful and creative enough to erect such monuments. So, the thinking went, conventional science must have been missing or hiding something. Ancient astronauts, aliens, or lost civilizations of Atlantis. Even some mainstream scholars have dabbled in this thinking.
Over here.
can men do such a thing to Father Monica?
They are not men like us, Papu.
Then what are they?
Some say they came from the stars. Others believe that they flew across the great water when their land sank into the sea.
Another famous example of pseudo-archaeology was the 1831 book Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, which argues that the first advanced human civilization was in fact Atlantis. Its technology supposedly disseminated all throughout the earth and jump-started human culture as we know it, before falling into the sea.
If the Casey readings about the existence of Atlantis are true, then might the Sphinx actually be a remnant from this advanced civilization?
And the people of Atlantis were called the Aryan race, white-skinned, red-haired, and blue-eyed ancestors of the modern-day Irish. That's right, y'all. Atlantis is kind of problematic. In the book, populist politician Ignatius L. Donnelly argues that Atlantis was destroyed by the Great Flood recorded in the Bible. He also cited studies of Mayan civilization that claimed it had a common origin with civilizations in Africa, Europe, and America.
The truth about the nature of this lost civilization exists in a hidden hall of records at 3 locations across the globe. In Egypt, near the Sphinx, underwater in the Bahamas, and in the Yucatan Peninsula.
Any 3 of these areas apparently would have all of the records that we would need to completely rebuild our history and understand how there may have been much more widespread extraterrestrial presence here on Earth.
This is not the case. A wonderful snarky review of Donnelly's book on Grudge.com reads, Donnelly used some really hinky science and linguistics combined with the racist theories of Mayanism to propose that not only was Atlantis real, but that it was in fact the origin of all people in the Americas, Europe, and Near East. An example of the airtight proof he offered was that ancient people in both America and Europe got married and divorced. Alright. And what's wild about this is not only that it attributes all human achievements to a secret ancient magic white people, it imagines Atlantis as the original colonists, spreading civilization in the same way that Europe imagined itself doing back in the day. Donnelly's conception of Atlantis naturalizes colonialism as the only way culture spreads, as the root of all human civilization. And that's kind of terrifying. As I'm sure you could have guessed, the whole Aryan thing made Donnelly's theories really popular amongst Nazis once they came around. Inspired by Donnelly, Atlantis theorist Hermann Wirth joined forces with Heinrich Himmler to found an organization known as the Ancestral Heritage Research and Teaching Society. They believed that Germans were descended from the mythic Aryan race, white Slavic giants who were responsible for all great human advancements like art, agriculture, and writing.
Completed in 1931, House Atlantis was designed as an institute for the study of Atlantis and the Aryan super race.
Hermann Wirth was quite fascinated by the idea of finding Atlantis. His idea was that this Atlantis was not somewhere in the Mediterranean or something like that, but in the North Atlantic region. And in his idea, in Atlantis, 20 to 25,000 years ago, a Nordic race was created that was to control and influence the development of mankind to a strong degree.
Notice how similar that sounds to the last 2 examples we discussed. And what if I told you that most of Ancient Aliens was just these old pseudo-archaeological arguments with a new fresh sci-fi coat of paint? Am I exaggerating when I compare Ancient Aliens to Nazi rhetoric?
Atlantis was the home of a highly advanced civilization which mysteriously disappeared into the ocean thousands of years ago. If Atlantis, like other formerly mythical locations, were discovered, would it offer proof of extraterrestrial contact with early humans? Is it possible that the course of human civilization has been determined not by history's most profound thinkers, but by some external force that was guiding them.
Even as we are today, we've been manipulated subtly by extraterrestrials, and this is still going on.
Maybe a little. And that's kind of the problem. They're not one-to-one, but they're more compatible than I generally want from my goofy UFO show. I want to be clear that I don't think the producers of Ancient Aliens or the History Channel itself are intentionally putting racist messages into the show. You know, probably. They're not, like, reading racist passages of Donnelly's book or anything, or talking about how Native Americans killed all the alien white people. But they did do this.
Why would a so-called primitive people have constructed a massive earthwork?
I still don't think the creators of the show are necessarily outright bigots. It's more likely to me that they just get wrapped up in the wacky sci-fi bullshit and don't see all the problematic subtext. This show's made from a perspective where they don't have to grapple with tough questions like, how does colonialist apologism influence their work, and what responsibility do they have to their audience because of that? Because they're talking about literal flying saucers. The level of nuance or reality is nowhere near that. It's for boomer conspiracy dads who love the History Channel's World War II shows with all its maps and battles, but wish it had Jesus and Martians too. Unbeknownst to them, the so-called ancient alien hypothesis both comes from and helps to reinforce far-right racial pseudoscience. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, over the last decade, the History Channel has exploited and fueled the popularization of alternative archaeology, or alt-history. Numerous programs in the network showcase ideas that, while not explicitly racist or anti-Semitic, have origins in colonialist projects and have been championed for a reason by modern extremists. In the fractured and constantly cross-fertilizing galaxy of extremist conspiracy culture, the white mound builders, now known on the far right as the Sultrians, share a stage with other characters from an ancient and racially glorious but suppressed past. Ancient Nordic-looking astronauts, biblical Aryan giants, Nazi scientists under the South Pole, and the occasional interdimensional ancient aliens in league with the Jews.
There were mystics or channels who were able to communicate with these beings who claimed to be either extraterrestrial in origin or claimed to belong to this civilization that lived in Earth's interior. They gave a lot of information about the building of advanced aerospace vehicles, flying saucers, and I think this is where Hitler's Nazi party got a lot of its information about Antarctica, that in Antarctica there is this ancient civilization or bases where they could find a lot of these advanced technologies.
It's an unfortunate reality that a lot of the theories on ancient aliens tend to be more on the Alex Jones side of the fringe than the pot-smoking crystal person side. While I'm sure it passes over the heads of most viewers, the worldview espoused by this show is a bit too compatible with racist biblical fundamentalism for my comfort.
You know of Earth? You've been there?
Once I stretched out my hand, and Earth trembled, and I breathed upon it, and spring returned.
You mentioned Agamemnon, Hector, Odysseus. How do you know about them?
Search your most distant memories. Those of the thousands of years past, and I am there. Your fathers knew me, and your fathers' fathers. I am Apollo.
One of the first mentions of ancient aliens in media was in an unauthorized sequel to War of the Worlds called Edison Conquers Mars, which, if you can't guess, was fiction. It explored the idea of Martians building the pyramids, surprise, surprise, and other authors like H.P. Lovecraft continued exploring the idea throughout their works.
Gazoo, the former headmaster scientist on planet Zetox? The which on what? The planet Oh, never mind.
But it wasn't until the 1950s and 60s when people started taking the idea seriously. The Bible, so to speak, of ancient alien theories is a book by Swiss author Erich von Däniken called Chariot of the Gods. It was a huge hit when it was released in 1968, claiming that aliens visited ancient cultures and were interpreted as gods, and written about in their myths. It analyzes various stories, attempting to show how the magic described in them was actually advanced alien technology.
If ancient astronauts did land here, what effect would they have had upon early Earthmen? Perhaps they were worshipped, feared, loved. Perhaps they brought gifts, a new world of knowledge, or simply the principle of the lever. If we accept the premise that beings from another civilization visited here ages ago, then some of the mysteries of our past take on a new and startling light.
Von Däniken is, to put it bluntly, a con man who mostly stole his theories off an earlier French book called The Morning of the Magicians. American author Jason Calavatio summarizes von Däniken's career in an essay criticizing an episode of Ancient Aliens based on his work. Erich Anton Paul von Däniken was born in Switzerland in 1935, raised a strict Catholic, and in Catholic school developed an interest in UFOs, like many youths in the early 1950s. He had a criminal record. He was convicted of theft when he was 19 and left school to become a hotelier. He was convicted of embezzlement after leaving that job. He took another hotel position and stole money there too, by falsifying records in order to obtain thousands of fraudulent loans to finance his interest in space aliens, and what the court later called his playboy lifestyle. The court psychologist declared him a pathological liar. Eventually, he would be convicted of embezzlement and fraud yet again, serving a year in prison. In 1960, two French authors who were interested in the occult, Nazis, UFOs, and H.P. Lovecraft put out a book called Morning of the Magicians, in which they tried to show that Lovecraft's vision of ancient astronauts could be correlated to the occult views of theosophy and the UFO movement. Jacques Brunier and Louise Pelliz put together the entire case of ancient astronauts as we currently know it, from the claims about ancient atom bombs to the claims about impossibly precise and heavy stone architecture. Their book inspired several, by Robert Trudeau, who presented Brugier's and Porel's discursive discouragement idea in a more popular and readable format. In 1964, Von Däniken simply appropriated this material wholesale for a magazine article, and on the strength of the magazine article, received a book deal for what became Chariot of the Gods. Though obfuscated through a mist of new age sci-fi bullshit, it's clear that these ideas have a progeny in the racist pseudo-archaeological narratives of the 19th century. Note how Von Däniken drew from a book that was explicitly written to be about Nazi occultism, amongst other things. To be fair, Von Däniken does implicate some European history in his theory, looking at Stonehenge and stories from the Bible, like claiming that the Ark of the Covenant was an alien energy weapon, or that Ezekiel was visited by spaceships. But the other example of supposed alien artifacts include the pyramids, the Easter Island statues, Pimapuku, Mayan pyramids, the Nazca lines, the Japanese Dogu figures, and I'm sure you're noticing a trend here. Throughout his writings, Von Däniken chooses to ignore ancient people's agency to create what he views as advanced works, replacing them with aliens in a way that previous generations did lost tribes.
How will our astronauts be welcomed when they set foot on another populated star? As enemies or as gods? We know from recent history how primitive people react to their first confrontation with modern technology. During the Second World War, American soldiers were sent to certain isolated islands in the South Pacific to build airfields and military installations. When the war was over, they went home, and a very curious thing happened. The natives of these islands, isolated from the outside world, lived virtually in the Stone Age, until the Americans came and went. Very soon afterwards, the natives began making straw and bamboo fetishes resembling airplanes, crude landing surfaces on their islands to tempt the visitors back.
The strangers had brought fabulous treasure with them from the skies. Tools, fantastic weapons, sky machines they'd never dreamed of. What else but gods could possess such superior knowledge? However, the islanders had a new religion. A new cult was born from the encounter between a primitive people and visitors from a highly developed, technically superior society. The Russian scholars Kazantsev and Zaitsev proposed that all religions began in just this manner.
Aliens, in Von Däniken's conception, act as the Aryan Atlanteans of yore, the idyllic colonialist origin of human civilization. And in that way, they also act as stand-ins for God in a creationist view of the world. Again, we see a new and very fantastic-sounding pseudo-archaeological theory reinforce an established conservative worldview. Rather than let his theories interfere with his Catholic upbringing, Von Däniken seems to see it as affirming his faith in a roundabout way. Von Däniken once stated in an interview, "I lost my Christian God, but I never lost God. I suggested in my book that thousands of years ago some extraterrestrials were here. They influenced the young Stone Age mankind. If this is correct, then we have to ask, where did these extraterrestrials come from? They were influenced by another race of beings, and you can play back this game for billions and billions of years and finally arrive at a starting point, and we say, here is God." This is a really patronizing view of civilization, seeing it as something that's only given to people by higher beings rather than developed naturally over time. Von Däniken, knowingly or unknowingly, is propagating the colonialist idea that social evolution has to be forced onto lesser people by more advanced people in order for them to achieve civilization, I guess? In some of his writings, Von Däniken even suggests that in the far-off year 2100, man might give the gifts of technology to a new civilization on another world. Like in the case of Donnelly's book and Churchill's speech, in Von Däniken's writing, societies only advance by being colonized by a more advanced force, until they become godlike colonizers themselves. It's an endless cycle of righteous colonization, which none of them seem to realize is not as good as they think it is. Von Däniken's follow-up book, Sign of the Gods, makes his racist views even more explicit. He seems to believe that humans were genetically engineered by ancient aliens, not an uncommon belief amongst this crowd. It's a sci-fi way to explain how God created man for a special reason. So, what do you think a guy who thinks that we were created by aliens thinks about race? Well, some choice quotes include, and warning, this gets pretty bad. The evolutionists say that man descends from monkeys, yet who has ever seen a white monkey, or a dark ape with curly hair such as the black race has? Were the extraterrestrials able to opt between different races from the beginning? Did they endow different human groups with different abilities to survive in different climatic and geographical conditions? Was the black race a failure, and did the extraterrestrials change the genetic code by gene surgery and then program a white or yellow race? Today, it is assumed that a primitive man has dark skins. Nearly all Negroes are musical. They have rhythm in their blood. I quite realize that I am playing with dynamite when I ask whether the extraterrestrials allotted specific tasks to the basic races from the very beginning, i.e. programmed them with special abilities. I am not a racialist, yet my thirst for knowledge enables me to ignore the taboo on asking racial questions simply because it is untimely and dangerous. Why are we like we are? Once this basic question is accepted, we cannot and should not avoid the explosive sequel. Is there a chosen race? Now, I know we use Nazi euphemistically a lot these days, but that's some Nazi shit! Also, notice how a lot of those quotes rely on Von Däniken making bad faith arguments like we see in Ancient Aliens. And there's a reason for that.
A young man's spiritual journey.
I was a boy, 16 years old, but I said, this is not God. What are we talking about?
A controversial bestseller.
I was mesmerized by it. I couldn't put it down.
And a scientific theory that threatened to change the world.
Everything was turned upside down by Erich von Däniken.
Erich von Däniken is a paid producer on Ancient Aliens and a frequent guest star. He's their favorite theorist. His writings form the basis of many of the show's theories. There's even multiple episodes devoted directly to his foundational work. And this is even close to the first time Von Däniken's work has been used to make highly entertaining television. TV played a huge role in popularizing his theories. In her article, Pseudo-archaeology and Racism Behind Ancient Aliens, Sarah E. Bod notes, a potent combination of tabloids and television helped to make Von Däniken's book a bestseller in the United States. Historian of pseudoscience John Clavio has remarked that while the book became a bestseller in Europe, it was the National Enquirer's underscoring of Von Däniken's work through a serial series published in a tabloid that introduced it to readers in the US in 1970. 3 years later, NBC aired an adaptation of the book, retitled In Search of Ancient Astronauts, featuring a cast of all white men, which translated and visualized pseudo-theories of archaeology and science for broad popular consumption.
Was the secret of electricity revealed to man thousands of years ago? Is it possible that this planet Earth has been visited by travelers from outer space? Did they wander through the throbbing light years of the universe in search of other life and find it here?
Continuing the tradition of Von Däniken, Ancient Aliens does repeatedly cite one work from the Western world.
In the Bible, the book of Zechariah, it's the book of Enoch.
The apocryphal texts of the Hebrew Bible.
In the first book of Moses,
The 4th chapter of the Hebrew Bible's Book of Daniel.
The Dead Sea Scrolls.
Could it be, as ancient astronaut theorists suggest, that the biblical figure of Noah was, in fact, an alien being?
For all its goofy stoner appeal, Ancient Aliens has at least as strong a boomer appeal. It loves the Bible, and like Von Däniken, it's simultaneously sacrilegious and careful to affirm that the Bible definitely happened. It's just the perfect show for weird old uncles. It's conspiratorial, it's Christian, and it has exoticizing views of other cultures.
Could Sigmund Freud's audacious conclusion be true? That Akhenaten's biological brother was in fact the Hebrew leader, Moses. The Book of Enoch also states that 200 watchers descended to Earth to oversee humankind and aid in our advancement.
These attributes to somebody from a low-gravity planet like Mars or being in space for a long time may well be the attributes that we see of the fallen angels.
Also, this may sound weird, but it feels kind of, I don't know, insecure? Like, it feels over-eager to show that humanity is significant on the cosmic scale. Maybe I'm just reading too much into it, but it seems like Lovecraftian, man. Ancient Aliens is a special yet hideous monster that we must love, but also quarantine and study because it's constructed of toxic waste. And I do love it, in the way that I love a nuclear explosion. It's novel and neat to witness, important to study, but shouldn't be anywhere near an unprepared crowd. I mean, it's a history, mythology, alien conspiracy, Bible, Nazi archaeology show. That's fucking buck wild. It's important to remember that all of this has ramifications bigger than the nerds being wrong about archaeology. Though, to quote Benoit again, frequently these people try to prove their theories by traveling the world and desecrating ancient artifacts. Secondly, they perpetuate and give air to the racist notion that only Europeans, white people, ever were or ever will be capable of such archaeological feats. In 2014, 2 German pseudo-archaeologists chiseled off part of the Great Pyramids of Giza to study their alien origins. A group called the Alien Project has also destroyed part of the Nazca Lines. Besides physical damage to artifacts, these theories can also act as gateway drugs for people to get red-pilled into darker fields of pseudo-archaeological thinking. In his book, Foundations of Atlantis, Ancient Astronauts and Other Alternative Pasts, Calavio speaks to this unintended consequence of Ancient Aliens. These shows serve as entry points for discredited 19th century ideas and points of views toward the sources of extremist pseudo-scholarship and politics. The idea that aliens build the pyramids isn't so funny when it draws young people to websites that quickly switch out the aliens for Jews and starts talking about gas chambers. Furthermore, Ancient Aliens rhetoric perpetuates racist notions that civilizations of Africa, Asia, and Americas are less advanced than those in Europe. It perpetuates the myth that the West is the most civilized, and non-Western advanced technology must have come from some paranormal source. And it robs native peoples of their own cultural heritage. In a tweet thread, medieval historian Chris Rydell explains the real harm shows like Ancient Aliens contribute to. It may seem small and silly, but it contributes to a larger systemic failure to recognize the history of non-white people, and compounds on the erasure of ignoring that history perpetuated by colonialism. He tweeted that, "I've had non-white students come up and ask me if their ancestors ever accomplished anything of value. They had been fed the vicious lies of white supremacists, discrediting all non-Western cultures. It was heartbreaking. These lies have consequences. It's not always aliens did it. White settlers claim there must have been a white race that built Great Zimbabwe, for instance. It was the default assumption of early racist African archaeologists, resulting to believe the black Africans, but this was part of the same issue in the recent gutting of AP World History program. Devaluing the era before Western imperialism allows white supremacism a chance to discredit any later achievement as caused by Western influence. That's what the Ancient Aliens theory does. It discredits the origin of civilizations, and almost entirely of non-white civilizations. People may suggest Stonehenge was built by aliens, but do they suggest the Roman forms or Pantheon were? No. And no offense to Stonehenge, a great site which I love, it doesn't hold a candle to the pyramids of Giza. That's comparing apples to oranges. The Great Pyramid was the tallest man-made structure on Earth until the Eiffel Tower was built 4,000 years later. So, are we wrong to love Ancient Aliens? No. Well, maybe a little. I don't know. Who am I, your parents? Like any piece of media, we have to be conscious of its broader implications and subtext. Personally, I suggest watching it like you would a problematic movie from the 50s, a Tarzan movie or something. If that's your thing, cool, but don't consume it uncritically, and don't let your love for it blind you to the legitimate problems others may have from it. So, I guess what I'm trying to say is Ancient Aliens problematic fave? Hey everyone, thanks for watching. So you may have noticed I'm a girl now, so that's... I mean, I've always been, but my name's Beverly now, so cool. This was a long video and took a while to come out, so thank you for watching it. If you want to take a break with something a little bit more fun, watch Laura Crone's video on Shazam. It is so good. Or maybe Curio's very short video on the same topic if you want a corroborating opinion. Alright, thanks. Love y'all. Bye.